Hello and welcome back. Last week we looked at some of the biggest stories from the first half of the year with the help of a collection of journalists and editors from across the New Arab. 2024 did not slow down in the second half, and we're back to take you through events that shaped the year in the Middle East. My name is Hugo Goodridge, and you're listening to the New Arab Voice. In June, we saw anti-Syrian protests and riots in Turkey, and in July, Syrians responded in kind against the presence of Turkish forces in northern Syria. Editorial and social media assistant Charlotte Hockey recalled events.
So those protests took place in places around northern Syria, where Turkey holds a particular influence, especially military. And so those Turkish forces and its allied militias, they really cracked down on those riots. And they deployed more troops, imposed curfews. At some point, they also used live ammunition and tear gas on rioters. Rioters and security forces clashed. And at the governmental level, officials blamed it on external actors sparking those riots. And also terrorist groups, labeling them as terrorist groups, putting the blame on the PKK, for example, or the YPG, which are Kurdish-led movements. Cities in Turkey kind of portrayed it as a broader anti-Turkey conspiracy. Finally, Turkey tried to put pressure on local Syrian councils to tackle the riots and push the narrative in the media that it was genuinely the Kurdish groups that sparked those.
There was no shortage this year of news about the appalling atrocities being committed by Israel in Gaza. In July, we also learnt about atrocities against Palestinian citizens from Gaza inside Israeli prisons. Analysis editor Charlie Hoyle.
The Zeddah Taman military base near Beersheba in southern Israel had really for months been at the center of very serious reports of abuses against Gazan detainees. It's important to remember, really since the beginning of Israel's war in Gaza, there's also been the kind of mass detention or mass arrest of Palestinians in Gaza. Hundreds, and if not thousands, have been taken from Gaza and detained in sort of a network of Israeli prisons.
Without trial?
Without trial. Slowly, largely from Palestinian detainees released, but also through lawyer visits and such. Lots of evidence has now come out of really, really graphic and brutal torture, ranging from sexual abuse, electrocution, waterboarding, sleep deprivation. Real kind of sadistic form of punishment of Palestinians detained. Of course, as you mentioned, with no trial, with no access to lawyers. And these reports gradually came out about this one particular base, the Zeddah Taman base. As a result, Israeli military police tried to enter the facility to detain 9 reservists accused of abusing Palestinians, who were then subject to an official investigation. This caused outrage amongst Israel's, right-wing, far-right. There were huge protests culminating in a mob that essentially broke into the base to try and, in protest at the arrest, but also to try and stop it happening. The mob included Israeli far-right politicians. It was really a show of support for soldiers, even though they'd been accused of, the most horrific,
just
crimes.
Just to clarify, this is a mob of people going out in protest of the arrest or the removal of Israeli soldiers who had been accused of torture
and
in Israeli prisons.
Torture and rape.
Yeah,
and there was video footage of one particular guard who was alleged to have raped a Palestinian prisoner using part of his gun. And just to give you an illustration, this particular Israeli officer went on to become a kind of celebrity in Israel. He went on Israeli television channels. Initially with his face covered, but then, uncovered. So there's a really kind of closing of the ranks behind the Israeli army, and really quite outrageous justification of what was kind of what is actually, because it's still ongoing, a policy of systematic torture of Palestinians. And I mean, some of the testimonies are horrific, and you can read them on the New Arab's website, but they're horrifying.
In May, we had the shocking news that the president of Iran, Ibrahim Raisi, was killed in a helicopter crash. This paved the way for presidential elections. Opinions Desk editor Benjamin Ashraf joined us to tell us how his prediction, and the prediction of many others, was so wrong.
Well, I have to eat my words a little bit here, because I remember discussing with you at the time that there were 6 candidates, really, 5 hardliners and 1 reformist. And I remember boldly saying there's no chance a reformist was going to win. Well, the reformist candidate won, Masoud Pezeshkian, won a runoff against Saeed Jalili, who was the hardliner. It was unexpected, pretty much. And speaking to Iranians and following our coverage of it, it seems like basically that the average Iranian, the millennials, the middle class, and the city, those that dwell in the cities were more they're more worried of a Jalili presidency than a Pezeshkian. So they turned out in opposition of the ultra-conservative rival rather than voting for the reformist. But nonetheless, it was a surprise, given that President Massoud had promised to ease up restrictions on things like the hijab ban and, I guess, return to the nuclear deal, things that had previously been off the table.
Well, a reformist president, then, it seems like a good thing, I think, for Iran, or perhaps better than the alternative. I mean, is this actually going to have a big impact on Iran? Is it all going to be liberal policies and moving forward to a bright, hopeful new future, or is it going to be a bit more of the same?
I think Iranians are seeing it through the lens of cautious optimism, really. They're trying to manage expectations, and they know it's not it's a jaded society, and it's trying to transition away from the years of Raisi and prior to it. And I think there is some level of optimism when it comes to domestic policies, but given the stranglehold of the RCG and Khamenei and the plan of the Axis of Resistance, he's likely to have far less leeway when it comes to foreign policy. As
Israeli forces continued to lay waste to Gaza, in the West Bank in July, Israel was breaking records for land seizures. New Arab journalist Oliver Mitzi explained.
So the Israeli government approved the seizure of 12.7 square kilometres of land in the Jordan Valley, and at the time it was the largest land grab in the West Bank in over 3 decades. Mm-hmm. Since then there has been a continuation of land seizures as well, including around Bethlehem, which houses a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Mm-hmm. This is part of a bigger trend, really, of increased land seizures by Israeli settlers, increased creation of outposts, which, although illegal by Israeli law, are often not dealt with by the Israeli military occupation in the West Bank, and then become settlements later on.
Also in July, Israel continued to cross names off its most wanted list, this time with Mohammed Deif. So
he was the head of the Qassam Brigades. So the Izzadin al-Qassam Brigades are the military wing of Hamas. Mm-hmm. He is widely believed to have organised the 7th of October attacks and planned it out, along with Yahya Sinwar, who was the head of Hamas within the Gaza Strip.
He was killed in the Al-Mawasi humanitarian zone, which, really should not be targeted by an Israeli airstrike. I hate to ask, because I fear I know the answer. I'm guessing this wasn't a surgical strike, and that perhaps there was plenty of other collateral damage. Ollie, fill us in. What was that damage?
So at least 90 Palestinians were killed in the strike, and 300 others were injured. Of course, being a designated humanitarian zone, there aren't supposed to be airstrikes within the area. And because it's a humanitarian zone, a lot of people seek refuge and shelter. Not to say that it has urban buildings to do that. Basically, many people pitch tents and have made encampments in the area because of the lack of bombardment, which other areas of the Gaza Strip sees, such as Gaza City or Jabalia, for instance.
And Israel doubled up on assassinations of top Hamas leaders at the end of July, when it killed Hamas political chief Ismail Haniyeh.
Just linking back to the election, it was actually on Masoud Pezeshkian's inauguration day, so on the 31st of July. And if we thought that the Israelis, by attacking a consular annex in Damascus, was an escalation, in this case they attacked him in his hotel room as a kind of allegedly targeted attack that had been planned for months prior. Ismail Haniyeh, if you remember, was basically the top dog. He was the head of the Hamas's political bureau, and he had been living in between Doha and travelling around the region for some years. It was a seismic event.
In August, Libya was suffering from banking troubles when gunmen attempted to kidnap the central bank governor, Sadiq al-Kabir. New Arab journalist Salma Bulgaria recalls.
He was abducted by an unidentified group. The reason behind his kidnapping remains unclear, but it appears in the context of rising tensions around the central bank of Libya, including armed sieges and disputes over the bank's leadership. Militia groups were reportedly pressuring for the resignation of Sadiq al-Kabir, the governor, over his management of all revenues and fiscal policies. This suggests the kidnapping could have been part of a broader attempt to exert control over the bank's leadership.
Libya is currently famously split between East and West governments. The kidnapping happened in the west of the country, but it does impact the east of the country. So how did the East respond to this?
So the Eastern administration, aligned with Khalifa Haftar, condemned the leadership changes at the CBL. They saw them as illegitimate. In retaliation, Haftar's forces ordered a halt to oil production and exports in the east, significantly impacting Libya's oil output, which dropped to less than half of normal levels. This blockade intensified the economic and political crisis, as most of Libya's oil fields are in the east under Haftar's control.
September was a highly momentous month for Lebanon, with the country barely catching breath between events. It started when the Lebanese authorities decided to move in on Riyad Salemi, the one-time financial wizard and governor of the Central Bank of Lebanon. Journalist Louay Faour came into the studio to explain an extraordinary month.
So Riyad Salemi, he was Lebanon's central bank governor for 30 years. I think it's one of the longest terms a central bank governor has ever served in the world. He was arrested on several charges in early September. They include embezzlement of public funds, robbery of government assets, and falsifying records and fraud. So some serious allegations. And the cases involved also include other people, including his brother, who was previously arrested in Lebanon as well. He was kept behind bars very briefly, but there are a number of people close to Salemi who are being investigated as well in this case.
They sound like very serious charges. Are they serious? And I mean, is he going to go to prison or?
I mean, they are very serious. So serious that it's led to one of the world's worst banking crises, worst financial meltdowns ever the world has ever seen. The World Bank says the financial and economic crisis Lebanon has been living for the past 5 years.
This is since 2019, yes.
Since late 2019 is one of the world's is the world's worst economic meltdown since I think they said like the 1850s or early 1900s. So I mean, Salemi is said to have orchestrated possibly one of the world's biggest ever Ponzi schemes. It led to the collapse of Lebanon's banking system, as I said, and Lebanon used to pride itself in the region on its banking system, especially in its heyday in the 50s and the 60s, and it's partly why Lebanon back then was dubbed as Switzerland of the Middle East. But it turns out that that's not necessarily a good thing. I mean, and as a result of that, millions of depositors, both Lebanese and non-Lebanese, have lost their life savings in the bank. So these charges are very serious. The
arrest of Riyad Salemi was historic for Lebanon, but the pager attack, also in September, quickly dominated events in the country.
It was huge, and it's like we've seen nothing like it anywhere before. I think it was unprecedented. The fact that Hezbollah's men were carrying around these ticking time bombs for years, these pages and these walkie-talkies, which blew up on the 17th of September and then the 18th of September. These coordinated attacks, and they just blew up with the press of a button. If we're going to talk about deaths and like the casualties, so counting the pager attacks on 17th of September and the walkie-talkie blast the following day, we have about 3,500 injuries in total and more than 40 deaths, including 2 children who were killed in the pager attack specifically. And the majority were Hezbollah personnel, not necessarily combatants. A lot of them were working with Hezbollah-linked organizations, whether like they were paramedics or in its civil defense force or
civilian,
but obviously a lot of
administrators and things.
But obviously a lot of civilians were hurt in the attacks. I mean, on the first day with the pager attacks, you had about 2,750, 800 roughly who were injured, and that's a crazy number. And to think that many people could have potentially died within seconds, you're talking like numbers close to 9/11. And that could have all happened within seconds with anyone that was carrying these devices. So it's crazy.
Obviously, you had 3,500 people were injured in the attacks across the 2 days. How much of a setback for Hezbollah was this?
I think it's safe to say it was the biggest setback the group had ever seen until then. Even Hassan Nasrallah, the Hezbollah's former leader, in the speech he made on the Thursday, so just following those attacks, he said this was a huge attack on Hezbollah, and he admitted that the attack hurt the group. I mean, it harmed them. Thousands of Hezbollah members were unable to fight after that. Thousands of them were left injured, some of them without fingers, without hands, without eyes. Some of them are completely, permanently blind. And this had all happened at a time Hezbollah was engaged in cross-border fire with Israel.
Also in September, Algeria stepped up to the electoral plate to choose a new president.
So President Abdelmajid Tebboune won a second term with 84.3% of the vote, according to the final results announced by Algeria's Constitutional Court. His challengers, Abdelali Hassani, who's an Islamist, and Youssef Aouchiche, who's a socialist, received 9.56% and 6.14% of the votes, respectively. And the turnout was 46.1%, which indicated less than half of eligible voters participated.
84.3% is an overwhelming victory. Dare I ask, was this considered to be a free and fair election?
I mean, many viewed the election as neither fair nor competitive. The president's challengers accused the electoral authority of fraud, and they also contested preliminary results. Many reports indicated irregularities and a lack of transparency, with opposition candidates claiming the election was engineered to ensure Tebboune's victory. I mean, there were also broader criticisms with restricted media freedom, suppression of dissent, and the military's significant influence over Algerian politics.
The pager attacks across Lebanon were a shock to the nation and a genuine blow to Hezbollah. But Israel was not finished there.
Right after the pager and walkie-talkie attacks on the 20th of September, Israel killed commanders of Hezbollah's elite Radwan force. Everything Israel had done that week was in preparation for what was yet to come. Israel wanted to make sure that it had disabled Hezbollah's communication network, eliminated those who it said or claimed were planning to invade the Galilee. What Israel says was a 7 October-like attack by the northern Israel. Then on the 23rd of September, that's when things really kicked off. That's when the escalation begun. I mean, since October 2023, Hezbollah and Israel have been engaged in fighting. Israel was carrying out airstrikes, in South Lebanon, in parts of East Lebanon, and in areas where Hezbollah has large control. This had remained very limited. And then on September the 23rd, Israel launched an all-out war in Lebanon, which they had been warning about. They carried out a massive aerial bombardment of the south, the Baal Bakirmel region in the east, and Beirut's southern suburbs, so in those 3 areas. On the first day alone, on the 23rd of September, Israel killed nearly 600 people in Lebanon, most of them civilians, and it was I believe, the deadliest single day Lebanon had seen since the civil war in the 80s.
Yeah. There were a number of tragedies across the country. Perhaps one of the most impactful strikes of this air campaign by Israel was when they targeted and killed Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah. Where and when was Nasrallah killed?
So Hassan Nasrallah was killed in a massive airstrike which consisted of tons of explosives, bunker busters, while he was underground in Hezbollah's headquarters in Har Tahrik, which is one of Beirut's southern suburbs, on the 27th of September. And it was exactly a week after Israel assassinated the Radwan commanders in a nearby area. Others died with Nasrallah, including some other senior Hezbollah officials, along with an Iranian general.
Hassan Nasrallah was a huge figure in Hezbollah and a huge figure in Lebanon. How much of an impact was this for Hezbollah and its leadership? Was it something they were able to sort of replace quickly?
This shook the region. I think it's safe to say one of the biggest assassinations the Middle East has ever seen.
It's seen a lot this year.
Yeah, this year, and since the whole Israeli-Arab conflict had begun. This was certainly one of the biggest assassinations the region had ever seen. It was likely that the head of Hezbollah would be killed. It's just the way they assassinated him. It was shocking, and a lot of people still can't really wrap their heads around what happened on the 27th of September, or even believe that Nasrallah is gone. Hassan Nasrallah, in what he represented for Hezbollah, in what sort of figure he was, I don't think it's something Hezbollah will be able to recover from for a very, very long time. Replacing Hassan Nasrallah is not easy.
He was a real personality, very charismatic.
Yeah. I mean, killing Nasrallah meant killing the spiritual leader and almost like the beating heart of Hezbollah. Yes, Hezbollah is an organized, well-structured group, and they have fighters and they have missiles, and Israel killed dozens and dozens of their leaders in this war. And the group doesn't simply end with the killing of one man, but everything about Nasrallah's killing, like I said, the way it was done, the timing, the location, I think it sort of like it broke their back.
Following a deadly air campaign in September, on October 1st, Israel launched a ground offensive in Lebanon, crossing over the border to meet Hezbollah on the battlefield.
People knew it was coming, but everything happened so quickly, and the pager attacks and the killing of Nasrallah sort of like left everyone in shock, and everything was happening at such a fast pace. Like we're talking about events which happened within weeks of each other. This was by far the most violent Israeli war in Lebanon ever.
How far did they get in their ground invasion? Bit of geography.
They've gone in quite a few kilometers deep. I mean, Israel claimed that they reached the banks of the Litani River on the eastern side of South Lebanon, so very close to the what's known as the Galilee Panhandle in northern Israel. So I think there's only 3 kilometers between the Israeli border and the Litani River in that specific location. So they went in quite deep, not as far as they had hoped. I mean, we've got to admit that Hezbollah's fighters on the ground were also, battles had raged for weeks, and Hezbollah's fighters were pushing Israel back. Yes, Hezbollah was severely hurt, and Israel's war on the group has really set them back. But on the ground, their fighters were still fighting the Israelis with full force. Until now, they're occupying this more than 70 border towns and villages across the Israeli-Lebanon frontier, and they're preventing people from accessing this no-go zone. And how much of it was impacted? Israel's wiped out dozens of these border communities, completely flattened them, and it's turned that part of South Lebanon specifically into scorched earth as part of their scorched earth strategy that they had started with. So just complete obliteration of these border towns and villages.
While Israeli troops were crossing the border into Lebanon, Iran's leadership decided that now was the time for a response to the killing of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran and also Hassan Nasrallah.
If the first Iranian rocket salvo was relatively coordinated with allies and with the US, this second one wasn't. And I was actually in Jordan at the time when it was happening, and from when it had announced that they had fired rockets to when they were flying over Jordanian airspace in Israel, it probably took about 15 to 20 minutes. Again, largely targeting Israeli military infrastructure, but the stakes were raised once again.
So did this push the region, up another level towards regional war, or did everything sort of simmer at the same sort of level it had been before?
It reminds me a bit of a game where when you've got a cup of water and you're trying to play with your friends to not make sure it doesn't overflow, and each time it seems like it's getting closer and closer to completely spilling over. And, once again, we thought that perilous gamble in April was a big thing, but now it's getting further and further to that, and you saw that reflected in mainstream media analysis. It's this kind of spectre of all-out regional war. What's worth noting, though, is that Iran basically wants to push its hand, as the same with Israel, but wants to avoid direct US involvement, whereas Israel does want that to be the case, given Netanyahu's own machinations about Iranian threats to Israel.
As Israeli soldiers launched an invasion of Lebanon, in Gaza they scored a highly symbolic victory when they killed Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar.
Yahya Sinwar, being one of the top leaders within Hamas generally, but also the leader of Hamas's branch in Gaza, is an incredibly important figure because he heads the operations within Gaza. He's quite well known in the sense that for a long time he was in Israeli prison. He was well known to Israeli society because of the fact that he spoke Hebrew. He learnt it during his time in Israeli prison as well. And he was very charismatic too. Would often taunt the Israelis to kill him, basically saying, "You know where I am. You know that I walk everywhere. I'm not undercover. I don't hide." This was all before the Gaza war.
Yeah.
If you want to eliminate me, then go on. I'll go out as a martyr. And that's essentially how he was killed. From what we understand, he was in Rafah, and he actually attacked Israeli soldiers, along with a couple of other Palestinian fighters who were with him. Once his ammunition and his grenades ran out, I think he was also injured as well. He was in this building. An Israeli drone, took the last footage of what we have of him alive, where he throws a stick at the drone when he's sitting on a sofa, and he was killed by Israeli soldiers. The reason why I say he was martyred on the battlefield is because for many Palestinians that's what it represented. Yeah. In the sense that he fought to the last, and he fought alongside his soldiers. He wasn't cowering in a tunnel or quote unquote like a rat, which is what the sort of common Israeli narrative was of his hiding. It marks the end of an era for the organization because he was with the organization from the 80s. Yeah. Like many of the members of Hamas. So it is the end of an era basically for the organization.
Not wanting to be left out of the electoral excitement that 2024 brought in, Tunisia snuck in a presidential election in October.
President Kais Saied has been re-elected with a landslide victory, securing 90.69% of the vote, again according to the Independent High Authority for Elections. His closest rival, Ayashi Zama, received 7.3%, while the third candidate, Zuhair Maghzawi, got 1.9% of the votes. Despite Said's overwhelming margin, critics have raised concerns about the legitimacy of the election, citing systematic disqualification of prominent candidates and allegations of political repression.
On the subject of political oppression, it was earlier on in the year, actually, we had the arrest of the head of Tunisia's Republican Union Party. Who was he, Salma, and why was he arrested?
Yes, so Lofti Mrehi, he's a prominent Tunisian opposition leader and, as you said, founder of the Republican People's Union Party. He's known as a vocal critic of President Kais. He announced his intention to run in the presidential election set for October, and his arrest marked yet another escalation in Tunisia's ongoing political crackdown under Said's government. Officially, Lofti Mrehi was arrested on charges of money laundering and opening unauthorized bank accounts abroad without central bank approval. However, critics argue that this is part of a broader campaign by President Said to suppress opposition ahead of the election. Many viewed the arrest as politically motivated, designed to sideline potential rivals and ensure that Said consolidates his grip on power.
With October drawing to a close, the Kurdish militant group, the PKK, launched an attack, hitting the Turkish state at its military heart.
The PKK, they carried out a coordinated assault on Turkish aerospace industries, which is involved in the development of advanced military technology, drones, fighter jets, helicopters. And these attackers used explosives and small arms to target the facility. There are varying reports of how many attackers actually carried out the assault, but it's estimated that 5 to 10 did. In terms of how many people were killed, it's estimated that 4 did, and they were all mainly workers at the factory.
This was obviously a serious attack. It did strike at the heart of, say, Turkey's military industrial complex. How did the Turkish state respond to this?
Yeah, so the Turkish state responded by launching airstrikes and ground operations against the PKK.
Classic.
In places like northern Iraq, where the PKK is particularly influential. At the internal level, Turkish authorities heightened security and its infrastructure, and especially around defense contractors like Turkish aerospace industries. Erdogan condemned the attack in strong terms. He kind of used this again as an occasion to put the blame on kind of labeling the PKK as a terrorist group. Yeah, it was just a significant escalation in the Turkish PKK conflict. Yeah, we'll have to see how that kind of plays out in the next year, I guess.
With the end of the year in sight, Iraqi society struggled with itself as the nation's government discussed draconian changes to the law. Associate Features editor Zainab Mehdi explains.
Okay, so just for a bit of context, personal status law, this was established in 1959, and this law is deemed one of the most progressive for Muslims in the region, covering marriage, divorce, and inheritance. The proposed changes would allow couples to choose between the personal status law and specific sect laws, potentially leading to unequal protections and deepening existing divides. This amendment could also legalise unregistered marriages, increasing the risk of child marriages for girls as young as 9, while making it more difficult for women to access healthcare and legal rights.
Was there any opposition to these changes, and who was opposing them?
Well, yes, of course. A number of groups and individuals have opposed the proposed changes, including Iraqi people, like the general public of Iraq. So across Baghdad and several Iraqi provinces, for several months, women rights groups and civil society organizations have taken to the streets in a substantial display of dissent against the Iraqi parliament's move to amend the country's personal status law. Critics have also argued that the changes threaten women's constitutional rights and that the proposed changes could deepen societal divisions along sectarian lines. And actually, earlier this year, I spoke to Razal Saleh. She's an Iraqi researcher at Amnesty International. She actually shared her concerns about the proposed amendments with me. In her own words, she said, "I worry for displaced little girls and teens who are at acute risk of being married off to relieve economic pressure. Families across Iraq live in poverty, and girls always bear the brunt of that. Honour, poverty and tribal negotiations, how young will the victims be in the years to come? If we continue down this path, generations of girls will grow into women deprived of education, healthy lives, and the most basic rights."
November was a rough month for Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. First, he was fired from his position by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and then, to add insult to injury, it was announced that international arrest warrants had been issued for both him and Benjamin Netanyahu. Charlie Hoyle again.
So in November, late November, judges at the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu, for Yoav Gallant, and for the military commander of Hamas, Mohammed Deif, who's presumed dead. The warrants said that there were reasonable grounds to believe that both Netanyahu and Gallant were responsible for war crimes, including starvation and blocking aid, as well as crimes against humanity, such as murder, persecution, and failing to protect the civilian population.
And how did they react to this?
Israel responded in typical fashion, firstly labeling it an anti-Semitic decision, and rather kind of buffoonishly, Netanyahu called it the modern Dreyfus trial, and said that Karim Khan, the chief ICC prosecutor, was motivated by anti-Semitic hatred of Israel.
After much devastation, displacements and death, and following a flurry of diplomatic efforts, a ceasefire was reached between Israel and Hezbollah.
So the ceasefire came into effect on the 27th of November, I think sooner than anyone expected. A lot of people expected this war to drag on for months and months and possibly even a year or more. The deal is in line with the UN Resolution 1701, which was actually adopted in 2006 after the Hezbollah-Israel war, but was never, fully implemented.
Yeah.
The two sides didn't respect the agreement. The main clauses of the deal, it's a US brokered deal. The US and France played sort of like the key roles in bringing about this deal. Stipulates that Hezbollah must move all of its fighters and all of its weapons north of the Litani River, which is in South Lebanon. And the Lebanese army must then move in to South Lebanon and deploy in the thousands, especially south of the Litani River. So the Litani River has sort of always been that sort of supposed to be a buffer zone, sort of between Israel and the rest of Lebanon, and that's the UN peacekeeping missions operation area south of Litani. So
UNIFIL forces.
UNIFIL. So the Lebanese army moves in. They're expecting, I think, in total about 10,000 Lebanese soldiers to move in over the course of maybe a year, and there must be no arms outside of state control. I mean, this isn't just in South Lebanon. This is everywhere in Lebanon. Yeah. The Lebanese army must deploy all across the border with Syria. There should all militias should be disarmed, but this begins from southern Lebanon, especially at the border with Israel. And Israeli forces who are still in southern Lebanon have 60 days to pull out. So this is sort of, a lot of people thought that the 60-day period was just a truce and that Israel and Hezbollah would go back to fighting each other again, but this is more of a sort of a trial period over for Lebanon to show that they can actually implement the deal.
Do we know if either side have kept to the terms of this?
Hezbollah hasn't carried out any violations. There was just this one incident where they fired at Israeli soldiers in the occupied Sheba farms, but that came only days after Israel had repeatedly violated the agreement. So from Israel's side, no, they've carried out hundreds of violations. They've continued to carry out airstrikes across South Lebanon, like targeting personnel, targeting vehicles, motorbikes. They claim that they're targeting Hezbollah personnel and anything that they say is suspicious or seems suspicious or quote-unquote active threats in South Lebanon. They've continued shelling border villages, demolishing anything that they couldn't destroy during the war. They've continued to demolish now, and we're talking very specifically along the border. Yeah. Israel said before the ceasefire deal was even reached that it would continue to go after Hezbollah even with an agreement in place, and that it would not sit idly by and let Hezbollah regroup and grow again. So right now they're using the 60-day deadline to achieve what they can and destroy as much as they can from Hezbollah's infrastructure. The Lebanese army has begun deploying in South Lebanon slowly, but gradually. Lebanon definitely wants to respect the ceasefire deal. Lebanon cannot afford this war to go on or another war. This wasn't a war that even the Lebanese government chose. It was a war that Hezbollah chose, and that Hezbollah eventually agreed to the ceasefire deal, which arguably was quite humiliating for Hezbollah.
After an arrest warrant was issued by the International Criminal Court, Netanyahu's legal troubles continued as his much-anticipated corruption trial began in Israel.
So Netanyahu is accused of accepting tens of thousands of dollars worth of cigars, champagne and other gifts from a Hollywood producer in exchange for assistance with personal and business interests. He's also accused of promoting advantageous regulations for media moguls in exchange for favourable coverage of himself and his family. And he's he has become the first sitting Israeli leader to take the stand as a criminal defendant, which is another low point for him in his political career. He's swatted away the charges in the most recent testimony, and he's refusing to accept any wrongdoing.
2024 has been a tragic year for the Middle East. The war in Gaza has both continued to rage and intensified. Violence has spread to Lebanon, killing hundreds and driving thousands from their homes. The whole region has been pushed to the brink of all-out war. But just as all was said and done, Syria stepped up with the most unexpected twist of the year. News editor Paul McLaughlin and I discussed events in the studio. Syria in 2024 was pretty quiet for most of the year until it wasn't quiet at all and became probably the biggest story of the year, which in a year of big stories is quite an achievement. In brief, just take us through what happened.
Okay, so as you said, it's been a very, very quiet kind of front, you could say. Idlib province, which HTS controlled, was there was a ceasefire. There was which had been in place for a few years. There had been tit for tat kind of clashes and raids, but generally it was kind of a quiet situation and stable. During that time, HTS, what we didn't know was HTS had been kind of preparing for a major offensive against the regime. And that all kicked off on the 27th of November when there began to be raids in parts of Idlib province and into Aleppo. And these I knew that it was something big, but I didn't realise it'd be on this scale. We thought initially it'd be some kind of raids to take reclaimed territory lost to the regime in 2021, i.e. parts of Idlib, some towns maybe. But then they kept pushing deeper and deeper into Aleppo province until they reached the gates of Aleppo, and that's when we realised actually this is something out of the ordinary.
And then they kept going. They took Aleppo, they took Homs, they took Hama. From the south we had forces who sort of followed their lead and came from the south of the country up into Damascus, where they eventually met with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Damascus, and Assad fled the country. It was a momentous time, I think, for the region and obviously for Syria itself. Both of us have sort of watched Syria now for a number of years. Did you expect this? Do you think anybody expected this?
I didn't expect this at all, and every analyst I've spoken to who kind of have been covering it fully since the start of 2011, none of them saw it either. I don't think there's anyone, except for one person I know who kind of has contacts within the opposition. They knew that something was going to happen, a major offensive, but they didn't realise it was going to be on this scale, and they didn't know when it was going to be. So overall, it was very out of the ordinary.
I think, one of the overriding sort of features of all of this was, yes, it was like an unprecedented offensive by opposition groups, but it was the collapse of the Assad regime that just crumbled at the mere sight of opposition. You had reports of them fleeing from their posts all across the country, and after a war that's gone on for 13, 14 years, that's killed 500,000 people or so. I think this lasted 11 days, I think, and the casualty rate was in the hundreds. It was astonishing how quickly regime forces crumbled. I mean, do you have any idea sort of why? What are your speculation about why they did collapse like they did?
Okay, I wrote about this in my Syria Insight a week ago or so. Basically, it was a perfect storm for this type of for this HTS offensive to be a success. Which again, a lot of Syria watchers are now kind of kicking themselves for not spotting this. One of them was the kind of quiet withdrawal of Iranian forces and Russia. Obviously, Russia has its primary concerns now is in the Ukraine, and it also has been doing this kind of slow pullout, which we've known about to Africa from Syria. It was they believed that Assad had effectively won the war,
as we all did, I think.
Exactly, and I think the Iranians also believed that because they were also pulling out their forces because they got massive economic challenges. And they're also concerned about what happens next with Trump, and also the collapse of the kind of axis of resistance in the kind of in the Levant region
with Hezbollah and Hamas.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's but what this really sums up is that how unpopular Assad was and how reliant he was on foreign forces. If there's been so many, I've been following Syria since 2011, since the start, and I've seen so many kind of these near near misses for the opposition or for Assad, whichever way you want to look at it, where he's been on the brink of collapse, but then in September 2015, Russia came in to halt an offensive in central Syria. In 2013, we had the Ghouta gas attacks. We also had a massive deployment of Iranian militia forces into Iran to Syria around this period. So overall, it really highlights the kind of overall unpopularity of Assad, and then we're seeing that now with the massive celebrations in Damascus and elsewhere. Even people who we believed were with the regime, they now say they had to kind of use this kind of discourse to not face trouble themselves, end up in one of Assad's dungeons.
Yeah.
But I think one of the final points is also the corruption, the levels of corruption. It was very similar, I think, to 2014 in Iraq, where the Iraqi forces collapsed in front of ISIS. There you had kind of like ghost armies, you had kind of people on leave paying, in Syria, people paying bribes to their officers to go on leave. You didn't have the top equipment, which is mind-boggling considering how much has been spent on the war, on the military during the war.
You mentioned Assad's prisons. I thought somebody brought up a really interesting point. I think you, like me, was just relentlessly following the news on Twitter that weekend on social media. Somebody brought up a really interesting point, was that sort of when we were watching that happen from afar, that offensive happen from afar, it didn't seem like nobody was measuring the success of the opposition really in sort of terms of town by town or village by village, but it was prison by prison, and which prison has been liberated now, and which prison's next, and where are they close to. And I think it all culminated when they got to Sadnaya prison, where we had, harrowing scenes of people who had been there, some for decades, in those prisons, and the appalling torture that happened and the appalling abuses. There's now mass graves being uncovered outside the prison. But now is the future. And what comes next? There are concerns about HDS and their former affiliations. How, it's difficult to say, I think, but I will ask anyway. How's the future looking?
I think overall it's more rosy. I think most Syrians across the political spectrum see a more brighter outlook. They have more of a stake in Syrian society. The economy now is not going to be captured by corrupt elements, at least not to the same degree as it was under Assad. There will likely be less money spent on the military. There will be more investment coming in, particularly if the sanctions are lifted. So I think kind of on the economic kind of social front, things will be a lot better. And obviously the level of repression, no matter what happens, could not be as bad as under Assad. But of course there's legitimate concerns about what happens next. HTS do have authoritarian tendencies. They have jailed a number of opposition activists, people who are for democracy and human rights and all these other kind of values. Which is the reason
journalists as well.
Journalists as well, exactly. The kind of principles of the 2011 revolution, or had to flee due to like the threats from kind of extremist groups. HTS and Ahmed al-Sharif, Jilani, also known as Jilani, he did rule with an iron fist in Idlib, but obviously not to the same degree as Assad did.
No.
So I think now is the time that civil society, which is which is extremely powerful in Syria due to their work during the war, will be mobilizing to ensure that that al-Shara doesn't kind of push Syria down the kind of one party or authoritarian kind of path. And I think we are seeing signs that this is kind of being successful. The other element is that HTS is now reliant on the sanctions being lifted and also create an environment which is conducive for the return of Syrian businessmen, a lot obviously more liberal than HTS.
Yeah.
So we have all these elements which I think will put pressure on HTS to kind of create a more kind of pluralistic political environment, and with freedoms. But the other element is I think a lot of Syrians, like ordinary Syrians, are just so tired of war and so tired of poverty, they would be they just want basically the basic necessities to be met. So long as there's not the same level of political repression under Assad, and then I think a lot of Syrians will just be happy for the lights to be on and to be paid their wages and to have food on the table.
And that was 2024. For everyone who has listened, thank you. Your support is greatly appreciated. This year has passed, but we will be back next year with new stories and new analysis of whatever 2025 decides to throw at us. This episode was written and produced by me, Hugo Goodridge, and featured Louay Faur, Nada Osman, Charlie Hoyle, Oliver Mitzi, Zainab Mehdi, Benjamin Ashraf, Charlotte Touquet, Salma Wagaria, and Paul McLaughlin. Our theme music was by Omar El Phil. You can find us on social media with the handle @TNA Podcasts for additional content, and you can email us podcast@newarab.com. That's podcast@newarab.com. You can subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and you can also rate and review, which helps us spread the word. Don't forget to follow The New Arab on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram for all the latest news, analysis and opinion from the region